The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. The Roman Emperor Markus Aurelius posited in his book Meditations that all things are implicated with one another, and the bond is holy. At the time of his writing, it was a philosophical concept. Today, it has been proven by science, genomics in particular. Wade Davis, the great Canadian thinker and anthropologist, in his talk at the Dr. Rix Distinguished Keynote address, The Wayfinders of Genomic Wisdom, said, "Studies of the human genome have left no doubt about the interconnectedness of all things." Davis went on to say, genomic science unveils the profound truth that we are all connected by the same genetic cloth. He argues indigenous perspectives combined with genomic insights can revolutionize conservation, restore ecological balance, mend cultural divisions, and provide the antidote to an ailing world. I invited Wade Davis to join me for a conversation that matters about the interconnectedness of life and why it matters. Wade, welcome.
Hi, Stu. Thanks for having me.
It really does matter that we understand that everything in the universe is through a remarkable connected chain.
I think biologically it's really important for us to understand that in terms of our genetic endowment, we're not that far removed from every other form of organic life. And we are all products of this extraordinary fluorescence of life that, as far as we know, has never occurred. We certainly haven't documented it as having occurred in any other place in the universe. But I think culturally, the recent revelations of genetics is even more important. You know, we have indulged cultural myopia since the birth of human awareness. The idea that, you know, my people are the real people and everybody else is a failed attempt to be me. Most indigenous names, incidentally, translate the people, implying that the blokes on the other side of the hill are savages. And anthropology grew up, particularly in American context, North American context, as a kind of antidote to that. And each culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that, they do so uniquely in the 7,000 languages of humanity. And so this was this incredible shattering of the European mindset. It was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. But what really sealed the deal was genetics. And that's what's so ironic, Stu, because when I was a student, there was a chasm between the natural sciences and the social sciences, where the very word genetics drove social sciences to, you know, to spasms of madness, you know. And you know, the social sciences saw the naturalists as being elitist, and the naturalists saw people, indigenous people in particular, as part of the problem. But the incredible thing is that in my lifetime, the geneticists have come to the fore if we accept the absolute scientific truth. The genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is an utter fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We are all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of Africa.
Got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So it's my understanding that we're talking about three different groups now. It initially was believed that there were two groups out of Africa, but I understand recently that there was a third group of humanoids in Africa that we are all descendants of.
I mean, the point is that we know we're born of Africa. We know that some people stayed home, others, probably a very small number, walked out, and in a very short order, 40,000 years, 2,500 human generations, brought the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here,
by walking.
But you know, that's not so unusual. I mean, if a hunting group expands its range by 5 miles a year over the course of 100 years, you've moved, you know, but I think the important point is, if we accept that truism, that we all share the same genetic endowment, well, it kind of means by definition that all human populations share the same genius, the same mental acuity, the same raw intellectual potential. And this is where it comes back to anthropology, because therefore how any one people, any collective of people associated by by occupancy of land, language, traditions, and interconnectedness. How they choose to use that genius is just a matter of choice. So it completely puts the lie to this idea of a hierarchy of culture. And the reason that's so important is it allows us to recognize that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of being. And then suddenly, instead of seeing the Western intellectual tradition as somehow existing outside of all these dynamics, we see that it's just one of many ways of thinking. And then we can actually begin to look into it, not to dismiss it, but to understand how that way of thinking caused us to become who we are today. So particularly in terms of how we treat the environment. And that led inevitably to a relationship with the natural world that was based on kind of extractive model. I mean, if a mountain's just a pile of rock, why not pull it down? Level it. And the point that anthropology tells us, and so the key thing then is that if we recognize that every culture has something to say, we can also notice that other cultures interact with the world in a very different way. Climate change, the extinction crisis, has become humanity's problem, but it's critical to remember it wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a very narrow subset of humanity with a particular way of thinking about the world. Most cultures around the world, the ethnographic record makes absolutely clear, interact with the natural on a model not of extraction but reciprocity. You know, some iteration of the basic idea that the earth owes its bounty to people and people in turn owe their fidelity to the natural world. How does that actually become operative? Well, I was raised, probably as you were, Stu, on the coast of British Columbia to believe that these forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of so-called scientific forestry that I was taught in school and I practiced in the woods as a logger for Macmillan Bloedel. Well, that made me very different than a kid from Alert Bay among the Kwakwaka'wakw,
right,
who was raised at those forests, the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven. Now again, the thing isn't who's right and who's wrong. Is a mountain a pile of rock or is it a deity? The interesting thing, again metaphorically, is how the belief system mediates relationship with the natural world. And that's why, you know, the voices of humanity are here to remind us that our way is not the only way, and we're also not indelibly stamped with a way of thinking that has proved to be scientifically unwise.
So one of the things about genomics I was very excited about was once we had mapped the human genome, we knew that the difference between you and me, your 13 billion bits of ACGs and Ts, is about 0.0001% different than mine. Yeah. Or AG's over there, or Samaya's who is in
or even with another primate species.
Exactly. You know. Like we're all so incredibly close. And so what I found great hope in that was, okay, armed with this information, are we now in a position where we can say, let's set aside our minor differences and embrace our common humanity?
Yeah, you know.
But we're not there yet.
Yeah, but you know, Stu, I think it's just a matter of time. I mean, I would say that in 10,000 years there'll be two events that happened in this century or the 2 centuries that will be still spoken about. One was Christmas of 1968, I guess Christmas Eve, I think it was, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon. And for the first time in human history, we saw not a sunrise or a moonrise, we saw an earthrise.
Yeah.
And that vision of the earth from space, you know, the famous, you know, a blue marble floating in the velvet void of space, did more to kind of change the way we think. And that has entered the zeitgeist. You know, when I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. No one spoke of the biosphere or biodiversity. You know, right. These are terms used by school children. In 1970, when the first Earth Day happened, I don't think there was a single government in the world that had a Ministry of the Environment. Today, there's not one that doesn't, albeit with various effectiveness. But what I find amazing is that, if anything, the revelations of genetics are more profound. You know, this cultural myopia I mentioned before has literally haunted us since the dawn of consciousness. You know, famously when Herodotus, 5 centuries before Christ, traveled east to the court of the Persian king Darius, and he had the audacity to come back to Athens and say there's something interesting going on over there. He was demonized by the people of Athens for cavorting with the barbarians, right? Well, that's been the way of things. And what I have been surprised that this power of this revelation hasn't really sat into the zeitgeist yet, and that's why I find.
Yet, I think, is the operative word there.
Yeah, no, it will. It will.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So Milton Wong from Vancouver, who was such a huge supporter of Michael Smith's work and was a supporter of Genome BC, and he had hoped, envisioned before he died, that based on this information that we're talking about right now, that genetics has proven that we are the same, we are not different, that we were finally going to be able to move forward. And I think that, you know, hopefully we will. Earlier when you were talking about, you know, sort of early European explorers coming with early science, but still being superior to those of the people who were here, we get Shackleton, who gets stranded in northern Canada. And the only way that he survived,
Antarctica.
No, he started in the Arctic first.
I see.
He got stranded for 2 years, and the only reason that he and his crew survived is that they were taken in by the Inuit, who taught them how to survive, and those survival techniques were what allowed him to get to the South Pole.
Well, you know, I mean, that's wonderful to think about that, because I mean, that's how Boaz had his revelation. Right. Boaz came over quite naive, and his first ethnographic experience was on Baffin Island, and he got caught out in a blizzard, and he realized just experientially that he was completely helpless, and then he saw how the Inuit dealt with that crisis.
In my intro, we talk about how indigenous, now you've got me questioning the use of the word, but local knowledge, in essence, of people who have been in the land for the longest can help us in conservation efforts and so on. And I'm thinking about the fact that we had this atmospheric river 2 years ago that washed out the Coquihalla Highway. And through an extraordinary sort of engineering effort, they rebuilt the river. But in the rebuilding of the river, local First Nations went to them and said, you know, we think that if you divert the river this way, which is probably based on its historical flow, you'll avoid this problem in the future. And thankfully, the engineers went, you're right. You're absolutely right.
But it shouldn't surprise us, should it? I mean, if you go to the Amazon, take something as well known now as ayahuasca, the preparation, the psychoactive preparation, kind of the main plant of the shaman's repertoire. You know, here's the interesting thing. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the Amerindians learn to combine these two morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? The only scientific explanation would be trial and error, which is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. If you ask the shaman, they say, well, the plants taught us. How about the Polynesian Wayfinders? You know, European transports were hugging the shores of continents well into the 17th century until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. We know that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians set sail into the rising sun. You know, within 1,000 years, they reached Tonga and Samoa and Fiji, and then they stopped for 10 centuries, but then they moved on 4,000 kilometers across the Pacific to the Marquesas, you know, east to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, northwest to Hawaii, and eventually around the time of the First Crusade, reaching Aotearoa, or New Zealand. And they did that with no navigational aids, as we would describe them, whatsoever. And what's more, it was an oral tradition. They didn't have the written word. What's more, it was all based on dead reckoning. So you didn't have a compass bearing to where you were going to go. You only knew where to go by knowing where you were, and that was only known by remembering how you got there.
Right.
So the Wayfinder, sitting monk-like on the stern of the vessel over a 3-week, 4-week journey, had to remember every sign of the stars, the moon, the winds, the currents, the signs of the sea. And if both that body of knowledge and the order of its acquisition was lost, should he or she fall asleep, for example, the voyage could end in disaster. And yet, somehow, they were able to do that. And we know that now. The Hokulea is right now doing a circumnavigation of the Pacific. I've sailed on the Hokulea with the Polynesian sail. I mean, they can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon just by watching the waves coming across the hull of the vessel. They can be in the darkness in the catamaran, in the hold, if you will, and they can sense as many as 5 sea swells moving through the vessel, distinguishing those caused by weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean. So this is what we tried to do at the National Geographic. When we tried to take on this issue of language loss, half the language in the world at peril. When we tried to celebrate the wonder of culture, we didn't do it through polemics or politics. We did it through storytelling, and we tried to take our audience to places and cultures where the utilization of our common genius was so dramatic and so undeniable that people would kind of, click and realize, hey, we all are equally brilliant, and so we always had a tagline, Stu, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon, applied it to the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Or in Tibet, we're speaking about the Buddhist science of the mind and how through meditative practice, the fourth of the Noble Truths, which is a delineation of the practice which can lead to revelation. And a Lama said to me, we in Tibet actually don't believe you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do.
Third and final break. We'll be right back. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. Earlier, when you were talking about speaking to the trees, I started thinking about the secret life of trees, but also our connection here in this conversation is about genomics. And if you take a look at the genome of a tree, it is significantly more complicated than ours. And in talking to Dr. Mike Dixon at Guelph University, he really studied the genome of trees. He said, well, of course. He said, you get to move around.
Yeah.
But a tree has to, once it determines that's where it's going to live, it has to be able to endure excessive moisture, a lack of moisture, wind, heat, cold, variety of diseases. And through this incredible web of roots, trees talk to one another. And I take a look at the success of trees. They have found their way around the world in every single kind of environment there is, and there's more of them than there are of us.
But it's like, we now know a lot of things, but there was a kind of a hippie book that came out in the 70s called, it was Secret Life of Plants or something like that. And, but I remember, we actually know that some of the stuff the guy was suggesting actually made, he was...
and genomics starts to prove it out.
But at the time, it sort of felt like hippie ethnography. And I remember my friend Tim saying, why would a plant give a shit about Mozart? And even if it did, why should that impress us? They can eat light. Isn't that enough? And I always say that, one of the things that I cherish the fact that I discovered biology. It's amazing. You can easily go through a 4-year university program and never study biology, which is kind of extraordinary. I mean, you could never graduate if you didn't know the difference between a painting and a photograph. But we graduate people all the time who can't recite the formula of photosynthesis. I maintain that no one should be able to run for office if they can't recite the formula of photosynthesis. This incredible verse that says, carbon dioxide and water sparked by photons of light gives us the food we eat and the air we breathe. That's
and the enzyme ribisco. Without it.
But the thing is, one of the things is that, to me, science was like when I it was so mind-blowing. I came back from the Amazon where I really discovered plants, and I was a very precocious plant collector, but I hadn't really studied botany. And I remember the summer course I took when I was very old, I was like third or fourth year of university, and ended up getting a PhD in botany. But I remember the night that I just understood the photosynthetic pathway.
Right.
I just went nuts, and I thought, one of the things, I was an anthropologist, so the metabolic pathways that intimidated students of botany, for me, were like origin myths, so I memorized them just effortlessly. And when I figured out photosynthesis, I just went nuts. I actually went from desk to desk in the science library, grabbing people, do you know what and I was actually escorted out by the security. I think I'm the only student ever at Harvard to be escorted out for elation at an intellectual discovery. But the other thing about science is it always seems to go hand in hand with arrogance, in the sense that, you can just, imagine those doctors back in the 18th century, or bleeding George Washington as he lay dying, having dosed him with arsenic and mercury, and then pumping out how many pints of blood, and that, which was a sort of protocol at the time. Right. You can just see the pomposity. You can almost smell the powder in their wigs, right, as they with such formality and such certainty prescribe those sorts of behaviors. It's a good image to remember when we contemplate where science is today. I'm thinking back, I used to work for a year in a logging camp on Haida Gwaii in 1978 or so. And I can tell you that in the year I was there as a forestry engineer, there wasn't a single decision made that had anything to do with the environment whatsoever. If there was a salmon stream, it was just a draw with a little bit of water in it, And if I had told my guys on the rigging that plants talk to each other, they would have called the Mounties, and yet now we know. So
right.
I think it's always worth remembering how little we by definition know, and how much there's still to be discovered. And that's really why I think the whole genetic genome endeavor has been the most sterling example of human achievement. No scientific endeavor. Maybe some innovation in medicine has saved some lives, but what other scientific initiative has liberated us from the worst of our faults, from this cultural myopia that's haunted us, If and when people finally wake up to the truth as demonstrated by genetics, maybe that's the day where finally there'll be some hope in this world.
And that's a good note for us to end on, because we're way over time for my television program, but all of this will exist online. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks, Stu.
Yeah.